Good afternoon, everybody. This is Marty from Dogs Blog. With tonight's podcast that I've pre-recorded because of my voice and can't breathe too well. Just one quick note. Something interesting happened during the time off, other than me getting sick or getting more sick, is I was at Costco 2 days before Thanksgiving, and I was in line. The lines were backed up halfway across the store or more, and I saw Carmen Sabatino and Gene Forte there. And they seemed to be having a good time at my expense, and that's okay. I don't really give a shit. But Carmen Sabatino made a phone call, and magically, Kurt Bunch appeared in the lines where they were. Carmen had a bunch of cakes and stuff, obviously buying for his restaurant for the holiday. And Kurt Bunch showed up, and they were laughing and joking and patting each other on the back. And it was just a real good, warm, happy moment for me to see everybody getting along so well after being such adversaries. And after all the things that Kurt Bunch told me about Gene Forte, and then patting him on the back and laughing and joking and having a good time. I just thought it was a great holiday spirit, and I think it's worthy, it's noteworthy, and something to be really excited about. Anyway, let's get on to some real important stuff here. Tom's report is now up. If you listen to the noontime report of the morning session, the jury did not see 1 second of courtroom time today, this morning, and I think that's sadly becoming the norm in this case, and it's not how it's supposed to be. Remember, the trial actually started in January. We've been counting the days since opening arguments, but the trial actually starts in jury selection, and actually before that in limiting motions. So this is how long it's been going on for. It's been going on for over a year. And the DA is still presenting her case of a bunch of stuff that I guess she thinks it's important. I don't know. I don't understand it, but what do I know? I'm an idiot. So the jury didn't get any time in the courtroom this morning. This afternoon they fared somewhat better. And finally Jack Abel got on the stand this afternoon and doing direct with Marlisa Ferreira. And they were talking about the July 20th, 2012 interview with John Evers and Kurt Bunch that Jack Abel had. And that was at the Pop and Cork. They showed up over there when he was over there talking to the Atwalls and Robert Woody. I think he said that he had previously said to them, the officers, that he had talked to Kathy Grinolds over at the Carson property prior to going to the Pop and Cork to do interviews, but he now knows that he talked to Kathy Grinolds after the Pop and Cork in the conversation with the officers. He had offered to take pictures of the Mike Cooley sign that he had in his yard. Apparently Mike Cooley, in his most defiant act of rebellion, I guess, other than spitting in Frank Carson's face, he put up a sign that faced the Carson property at the back of the Cooley property that faced the Carson property that said, "Fuck you." And this, for some reason, he probably thought that was really cute. He said he had taken pictures of that sign. This is Jack Abel, had taken pictures of the sign, but never did give it to the officers because he said he never saw them. He was hired on July 13, 2012, and this is a big bone of contention with everybody because they're saying that he was hired after the search warrants, is what the DA is saying. But the defense is saying he was hired 2 days before the search warrants were served on July 15th. And he said that he was only on the case until about November 2012 when he did his last interview. He said he had talked to Corey Brown. He was trying to find out who had access to the Frank Carson property. Corey Brown, he said, was stating that he was trying to contact Ryan Schmidt. And he thought that, he said at the time, he thought that somebody had talked to Ryan Schmidt already, but apparently they had not. Jack Abel said he never talked to Ryan Schmidt, and he wasn't sure if anyone else had told him that law enforcement had talked to Ryan Schmidt. Corey Brown, he said, did say that he was trying to have a conversation with Frank Carson in regard to the issues in this case. And Jack Abel said he would try to arrange a sit-down with all involved, but he was unable to, or it never happened, or he's not sure what happened there, but it never did come off, apparently. Jack Abel said he wanted to know if what law enforcement knew or didn't know, or whatever the case may be. He was asked if he told officers he had a signed contract on that date. It was July 20th, 2012, when he was talking to Corey Brown. But he actually, he said it was about a week ago, so it would have been the 13th. That was a Friday. He looked it up on his calendar on his phone. That was a Friday, and it was on the 20th of the interview was done. He said about a week ago he had a signed contract with Frank Carson for him to do a little bit of leg. He said he wasn't really familiar when Corey Kaufman went missing, or when Corey Brown told him, or who had told him. He really wasn't sure. He really wasn't sure of the date or any of that stuff either. He had seen the flyer, though. Abel said that he did ask Corey Brown if someone said that Corey Kaufman had been at the Frank Carson property. There was an objection in there. There was a long sidebar, and that was a thing of the afternoon with sidebars. He said Corey Brown said there was someone who put Corey Kaufman on the property, but he said he never was told who that person was. He said he also had an interview with Frank Navarro and John Evers on October 3rd, 2013. And he had talked about, when he talked to Charlie O'Dell, he had initially gone there in reference to another case. They ended up talking about Corey Kaufman when Charlie O'Dell was in custody. Marlissa Ferreira, for some reason, asked him, did he record the conversation? And he says, it's a custody situation. You cannot record conversations in the jail. Marlissa Ferreira, for some reason, asked, why not? It has nothing to do with anything. Objections all over the place, and the judge says, let's move on. He said he did tell Frank Carson what O'Dell said, but he has not talked to anybody else about Corey Kaufman at any time from then until now. He told Frank Navarro that he had talked to Poppenkork employees, that meaning mostly the Outlaws and Robert Woody, and he had talked to Kathy, somebody by the name of Kathy, which would be Kathy Granolds from the Frank Carson property, but he only talked to her one time. And Abel said he told Kathy Granold some statements apparently that were made by Frank Carson. Or I should say, if I wasn't clear about that, Kathy Granolds made some comments of statements that were made by Frank Carson. And he said he was not told the questions that he is to ask anyone that he talked to. He also talked to Bill Borba. He did not recall any issues with Bill Borba's hearing. Marlissa kind of went into this a little bit and wanted to keep talking about how old he was and if he had trouble hearing, and et cetera, et cetera. And he said he didn't have any problems talking to him. He never interviewed Patrick Hampton, Keith Hobbs, and she started to go into something about Charlie O'Dell. There was an objection, another sidebar of what O'Dell said, and when they came back, they talked about O'Dell had picked up Mike Cooley in Oakdale, which was not what happened apparently, but he had said originally, I think, Oakdale, or somehow it got misconstrued. And he never mentioned to investigators Keith Hobbs or Eula Keys was there with him because he didn't know who they were. O'Dell, he said, says that Mike Cooley killed Corey Kaufman, but he didn't mention Kaufman by name. O'Dell was called when the car broke down, and they said they had just gotten rid of a body. And again, she asked him, did O'Dell ever say that Mike Cooley said he killed Corey Kaufman? And he says no. He said O'Dell never said that Mike Cooley admitted killing Kaufman. There was a Frank Navarro and John Evers interview in November of 2013. He had told them he had somewhat of a falling out with Frank Carson. It was about Jack Abel talking to law enforcement officers, and Frank Carson felt that was going over the line with an investigator that would talk to the cops and discussing cases with law enforcement, mostly involving the People versus Valley, which was a case that Frank Carson had at the time. He said Frank Carson did not appear angry, but he was, a little pissed and a little irritated. He did not recall, Jack Abel did not recall if they gave him a flyer to look at, the missing person flyer for Corey Kaufman. He said he did not recall saying Mike Cooley was involved or anything like that. Apparently Mike Cooley's name never came up that early on. He had learned at some time around the altercations with Mike Cooley and Frank Carson, disputes they were having, but he didn't recall when he was first became knowledgeable of that stuff and became aware of the altercations. He said that Corey Brown had told him that Corey Kaufman was seen leaving a friend's house, supposedly going to the Harson property, and he was asked if he knew that was Mike Cooley's house. And he says, well, is that the house that had the sign that said "fuck you" pointed towards the Carson property in the backyard? And Marlissa Ferreira asked him if he had been hired after the Poppenkork and the other property search warrant. He didn't recall specifically, but on the 20th interview, 7/20 of 12 interview, he said that it was about a week prior to that he had been retained. Marlissa Ferreira went into asking him about Steve Duden, and he knew Steve Duden. Initially he said no, but then he immediately said, oh yeah, I know who he is. They had known each other from Modesto Police Department, and then Steve Duden was working as a private investigator, working under someone else's license as an investigator in Modesto. He said he had collected some statements and photographs during his investigation. He said he had seen a photograph of the sign in the Cooley yard that faces the Carson property that said "fuck you," but he didn't take the picture. But the picture obviously was taken from the Carson property. Unknown who took the picture. He just saw the picture of the sign. And he said that he was hired to find out why that Frank Carson was the focus of attention on this investigation in regards to Corey Kaufman. He said the pictures of the sign were given to him by Georgia DeFilippo. There was a long series of objections and a bunch of questions here, and finally it comes out that no one had told him not to talk to the people behind the Carson property, meaning the Cooley the Cooley clan. He was not told not to talk to them. It's just Mike Cooley was never ever a target, at least at that point. The judge sent the jury out to break around 2:58. They had some questions that needed to be clarified with the judge. And the DA said there's relevance to whether Frank Carson or Georgia DeFilippo hired Jack Abel and had known Steve Duden. For some reason, that's an issue with Marlissa, whether he knew Steve Duden or not. He said mostly because Steve Duden had put trackers on cars she's saying, for Frank Carson. She said the jurors should be able to distinguish themselves for the evidence, and it should be heard. Judge Aniga kind of looked at her kind of funny as she get those looks on her face, very expressive in her face, and she says she's not tracking what the DA is trying to say here, along with Steve Duden and the tracking on the cars. And she says the DA said it goes to Frank Carson's intent, and Jack Abel and Steve Duden, if they were being truthful, they would say that Frank Carson hired them both to track either track people or use GPS devices of some sort. At this point, as Judge Aniga likes to do, she'd had a long conversation with Marlissa Ferreira going back and forth, and it turned into a legal referendum class or some sort, and Judge Aniga is kind of tutoring Marlissa Ferreira instead of just applying the law. Judge Aniga was not going to allow that line of questioning, so Marlissa Ferreira starts asking other questions, what she can or cannot go into, and finally the judge says, well, ask him and find out, and we'll see if he gets objected to, and I'll rule. Marlissa Ferreira also wants to question some more of the violating attorney-client privilege. It appears they're really not an answer to this question, and Judge Aniga says she has to do some more research into it. She's a very technical judge, and she really, tell you the truth, she doesn't really seem to understand and needs to just rule on some things, and she doesn't. So this is going to have to be ruled on at a later date after she gets her researchers looking at it, because she says there is no case law in regards to attorney private investigator privilege. Judge Aniga did note that Marlissa Ferreira is trying to deflect that there was something that was being done wrong or devious or something along that lines, and she's not going to allow Marlissa Ferreira to go into some of these questions. She says that she told Marlissa Ferreira that she's creating some issues that actually aren't there, and there's a real strong insinuations made by Marlissa Ferreira in all her questions instead of just asking questions. So by the time they got done with all this stuff, the jury wasn't back up until about 3:51 p.m. They broke for break at 2:58, so it was almost an hour. And she went back into direct with Jack Abel and asked him did Steve Duden ever say that he was tracking cars, and Abel said, I don't recall. I don't remember him saying anything about it, whether he did or not. Frank Carson, he said, never said either what Steve Duden was doing or not doing or whatever for him. For some reason, Marlissa Ferreira asked him if he had interviewed Scott McFarland. He said he had not. He had never interviewed Praveen Singh, and also somebody by the name of Greg Valdez. I have no idea who Greg Valdez is. There was also a Martha Odell, the wife of Charlie Odell, but he only had a brief conversation with her on the phone, relaying some information from Charlie Odell after he visited him in the jail. He never actually interviewed her. and there was no other information that he had provided to law enforcement officers. Marlissa Ferrer asked him when the last time he spoke to Frank Carson. He said well over a year ago. There was no talk of the case or the preliminary hearing or the trial, and he had never spoke to Percy Martinez, that's Frank Carson's attorney, about his testimony or anyone else about the case. No further questions by the DA at this time. Percy Martinez started cross with Jack Abel and went into again about when he was hired in 2012 by Frank Carson. He says he was hired by Frank Carson, not Georgia DeFilippo. He said he was never asked to intimidate or tell people not to cooperate with law enforcement. He did not suppress any type of evidence. He said the Charlie O'Dell contact was in regards to another case initially, and I forget the name of the case. I don't think it was a Valley case. It was something else. And because in 2012 he was working for Frank Carson in the Valley case, and he was looking into something else. That's how he initially talked to Charlie O'Dell. There was also some cell phone information in that case too, that he would the Valley case. So he had some information, and Frank Carson had some information on cell phone evidence, also in regards to Corey Kaufman. Jack Abel, they had 2 copies of the contract that was signed that hired him. One was actually an original, and the other was a copy. And he had both sitting in front of him on the stand. He had given them to his attorney to turn into the court. It was signed on July 13, 2012. Remember, that's 2 days before the search warrants. He said the contract, as is typical, was left at Frank Carson's office for him to be signed at his earliest convenience. He did not observe him personally signing it. But he did say the contract was signed prior to the search warrant. After the search warrant, he said Frank Carson had provided some information. There's limited information that they have to give to the people that own the properties that are searched, and there was some limited information there about some of the addresses and whatnot that was being searched. But again, he said that the contract was signed definitely prior to July 20th, the date of the interview with Corey Brown. He said it was about a week before that. But Jack Abel did not recall exactly when Frank Carson actually signed that contract. He says he'd been an investigator for 21 years, and he also taught classes at Cal State for 18 years in investigations and things like that. He did a lot of investigations for attorneys. And Percy Martinez asked him if it was uncommon for attorneys to hire private investigators prior to any charges being filed. And he says, no, that's commonplace. It happens all the time. He says he's aware of search warrants. They are assigned for specific locations. They're required by law to do that. Percy Martinez was asking about when he was talking to the Atwalls and Robert Woody at Poppencork, and that's when Corey Brown and John Evers showed up. He told them that he had been hired by Frank Carson about a week prior, which would make it around the 13th. He told Corey Brown he saw the search warrant, but not the affidavit. Now, there's a difference there. The affidavit is what the officer fills out under oath of the information that the judge looks at, determine to authorize a search warrant. Then the search warrant has to have the date, the locations, and certain dates and stuff like that on it. The affidavit has more information, but those are typically sealed, as was in this case. But the search warrant has to be made available to the people being searched. He also said that Corey Brown said in that interview that the investigators had talked to Frank Carson, and it didn't go well when they talked to him. And there was an objection that was overruled to that, the objection by the DA, but ended up in a sidebar anyway, and then it was overruled. He was also asked by Percy Martinez if he told Corey Brown that Frank Carson was not talking to Frank Navarro. And he said yes, very adamantly. He said yes. Frank Carson was very clear about not talking to Frank Navarro. He said that Corey Brown said that they needed to talk to people on the properties in the area around the Carson property, because Corey Coffman had said he was going to a friend's house, which he had done apparently with Mike Cooley, and then he had left there, and Cooley's claiming that Coffman said he was going to get the pipes on the Carson property. And Corey Brown said that Corey Coffman had left that friend's house, which meaning Mike Cooley's house. That's where we stopped for the day. We did get a little bit of time in, probably about an hour and a half with the jury. Nothing this morning with the jury, but an hour and a half this afternoon, maybe a little more. So I guess that is an improvement somewhat. Tomorrow we're back at 9 o'clock. And with Jack Abel will probably be on the stand again. Don't forget the PayPal buttons at the bottom of each report. I have my sponsors that are up, Doug Maynor and Merced Tile Supply out of Merced. They've got some more. He sent me some more pictures and stuff. I'm going to get those up pretty soon and show you some of the stuff that he's doing. It's really pretty good stuff. That's about all I got. If anybody has any questions or stuff, please don't hesitate in sending me emails. Send me messages on Facebook or Dog's Blog page, or Dog's Blog notification Facebook page, or however you want to do it. That's okay with me. Let me know what you're thinking, what your thoughts are, what your questions may be, because somebody else is probably thinking the same thing. Remember what I always say: don't take my word for it. Come to court and find out for yourself. Good night, everybody.